Thank you very much, all of you, for coming here today. We are here in new session of the permanent seminar Face and Trace of Violence. And today we have the honor to have here with us Dr. Olivera Simic. Is correct, right? Okay, so let me introduce you to the doctor. She is a senior lecturer with the Griffith Law School, Griffith University from Australia, a visiting professor with the University for Peace in Costa Rica, and visiting fellow with the Traditional Justice Institute in the Ulster University in Balkans. Olivera published numerous articles, book chapters and books. Her latest edited collection, Transnational Justice and Reconciliation, Lessons from the Balkans, with Martina Fischer, was published by Routledge in 2015. In 2017, with a group of transnational justice experts, she published the first textbook in transnational justice called An Introduction to Transnational Justice. Her latest monograph, Surviving Peace and Political Memory, was published by Epinephrix in 2014. Olivera is currently finalizing her monograph, Silenced Victims of Wartime Sexual Violence. And today we have the opportunity to hear part of her works with this presentation volume, but I want to speak out making art from women's testimonies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yo hablo un poco español. Buenos días a todos y estoy muy feliz por tener la oportunidad de charlar sobre mi trabajo en Madrid y en vuestro instituto. Vine a Madrid por primera vez el año pasado y decidí que quería volver otra vez porque yo disfruto mucho la ciudad, la gente, el idioma, la cultura y las playas con mariscos y bocadillos de calamares. Me gustaría agradecer a Paco, Miriam, Laura y sus colegas por organizar mi seminario. Yo conocí a Paco el año pasado en Minnesota en un taller de expertos de justicia transicional. Tengo mucho aprecio por el trabajo innovador de Paco sobre memoria histórica y exhumaciones y necropolítica en España, el cual me parece muy importante. Me gustaría agradecer a usted también por venir al seminario. Mi trabajo es comparativo y en los últimos años ha estado publicando y buscando y trazando paralelos entre los Balcanes, que son mi campo de investigación y experticia, y América Latina, en particular Argentina y Perú. Creo que nosotros necesitamos trazar paralelos entre los diferentes casos de memoria y justicia transicional para entender las similitudes y diferencias entre países y comunidades que han lidiado con un pasado violento. Yo he estado investigando diferentes expresiones de arte y su función en justicia transicional. He estado escribiendo y publicando sobre teatros documentales en los Balcanes que usan testimonios originales de las víctimas de regímenes violentos pasados y los llevan a los escenarios. Durante mi trabajo de investigación he desarrollado una relación profesional y personal con el teatro en Serbia, el teatro DAH, y ese teatro viaja y monta sus obrazos alrededor del mundo. Sus obras tocan el tema de cómo lidiar con el pasado. Hoy estaré hablando sobre el grupo DAH de Serbia y su trabajo de justicia transicional en la ex Yugoslavia. El año pasado el Teatro DAH celebró 25 años de su trabajo y un libro sobre su trabajo fue publicado. Yo tengo una copia del libro conmigo si alguien quisiera mirarlo. En general estoy interesada en saber cuál es el rol del arte y de los artistas en los procesos de justicia transicional, así como su rol cuando la violencia política ha terminado y en las secuelas que ha dejado. Si bien el arte no puede reemplazar los mecanismos formales de justicia, puede ofrecer una contribución preparativa, simbólica a estos procesos. Vale, yo voy a cambiar a inglés ahora y presentar mi artículo que se llama But I Want to Speak Out, Making Art from Women's Testimonies. So maybe just before I start to speak, I just want to say a few more words. I'm originally from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from former Yugoslavia, but I work in Australia for the past 10 years with the law faculty, and my interest is in transitional justice, particularly in non-judicial mechanisms. I'm a lawyer, I'm an international lawyer, but I'm interested more in non-judicial grassroots alternatives forms of justice rather than judicial mechanisms. Of course, as a lawyer, I'm interested in those ones too, but I believe that alternative grassroots mechanisms can bring a lot to people and certainly can bring a form of symbolic reparation that I want to talk about. So over the last few years, I spent a lot of time investigating the work of a few theaters, but in particular I worked with the DAH theater, and I'm going to talk today about their work and I guess methodology of their work and what have been then doing in terms of dealing with the past, violent past in former Yugoslavia. So this particular paper is about their work and their performances, or one particular performance that is based, and you can take a look if you want, that is based on this book. That's a collection of women's testimonies about violence from former Yugoslavia. And I will explain more how they use this book to bring some of these women's testimonies on the stage. So in order to preserve women's memories and make them visible and heard, a new wave of documentary theater has emerged in the Balkans that uses archival, authentic testimonies collected in private hearings and public legal spaces such as courtrooms and also other spaces. So in this paper I focus on theatrical plays that were created by 3 female theater directors from Bosnia, from Serbia and from Kosovo. So to produce these plays, all 3 theater directors used this book called Women's Side of the War. And so they used women's testimonies of violence in war endured as a conflict beset the region in the 1990s. So the testimonies, these testimonies were collected and published by non-governmental organization Women in Black from Belgrade. So through these theater plays, the 3 theater directors have created basically space for women's voices about the daily injustices suffered during the war to be made available to the public. So they used performance as a strategy for intervention and for truth-seeking, while actively promoting social and symbolic reparation. So this kind of reparation, so these are all, as I speak, I'm going to show you a lot of the images from these 3 plays, and this particular photo is from the Dach Theatre from Belgrade play Crossing the Line, that I will talk more. So these reparations, symbolic reparations, Margaret Urban Walker calls them the expressive dimensions that constitute the communicative act of expressing acknowledgement, acknowledgement, responsibility, and intent to do justice. So these plays, they bring on stage unique and universal women's testimonies about war and violence that cross, very important for former Yugoslavia, they cross religion and ethnic lines, because I guess you are aware, or you may be aware of the situation in Bosnia and why we had a war. It was a war between three main ethnic groups, and pretty much Bosnia is still a very divided place. So they try to use women's testimonies regardless of the ethnicity of the religion of the women, and bring to the stage unique and at the same time unique and universal women's testimonies about war and violence that, as I said, cross regional and ethnic lines. So also I'm going to show you some of the stories that they brought to the stage. I may leave maybe a couple of seconds that you can just read, and then I will continue speaking. These are all testimonies from this book that they used on the stage. So by bearing witness to these experiences which are lived on the stage, the audience basically takes a part in the public acknowledgement of the crimes committed towards women, and thereby actively engage in an act of symbolic reparation. So in recent years, women's testimonies have provided critical evidence for challenging normative views of law, yet these testimonies have not been readily available or accessible. Rather, many of these women testimonies have stayed buried in official documents and archives or too often have not been archived at all. So the few that have been made available have tended to be fragmented rather than narrative testimonies. And such accounts are almost exclusively the kinds of testimonies permitted in the courtroom, even though they do not let a woman fully explain what has happened to her. And this is because strict rules govern the admission and collection of evidence in trial is adduced by the prosecution in order to narrate and prove the facts supporting the charges, rather than to listen to particular experiences. Each of these stories cannot be, or each of the testimonies cannot be fully narrated, because the law is interested in facts and figures, and it's interested to fit particular narrative into legalese and what's needed for the particular case. So in legal spaces such as the courtrooms, women who testify about the suffering, their experiences are often either interrupted while they're speaking because of timing and because of the topic control, which diminishes and minimizes a woman's competence and agency to express her feelings and allow her narrative to flow in natural fashion. So judicial notions of relevance are restricted, and judges tend to view appeals to emotions as irrelevant, right? While simultaneously fitting, as I said, survivors' narratives into pre-existing fixed legal categories. So not only women are restricted in what they can say in legal settings, they are also discouraged from discussion their feelings, which are, as I said, often characterized as irrelevant, subjective, or even detrimental in the process of giving evidence. So this rigidity has negative consequences for women, since it is their experiences that have largely been excluded with predominantly legal categories. So as a consequence, women survivors of wartime violence have often not felt their authentic voices, that these voices have been heard and respected, but rather muted from official discourses and from the public domain. So in order to preserve women's testimonies, in order to acknowledge and make them accessible to wider community, I said this new wave of document theatre has emerged in the Balkans that use these testimonies collected in private settings and public legal spaces such as the courtrooms. So in this particular talk and paper, I analyzed the contribution of such theatre-based projects to transitional justice processes in the Balkan region and suggest that the act of transforming traumatic evidence into art may serve as symbolic reparation, as I said, and validation, very important validation and acknowledgement of women's experiences of pain and loss. So basically, with my analysis, I'm trying to demonstrate the potential for innovative gender-sensitive conceptions of justice to be encapsulated in women's experiences of war and violence. So this is what one of the editors of the collection, Women's Side of the War, had to say about how they compiled the book of the testimonies that has been used in this particular plays. So the feminist documentary theatre has the potential, I think, to create an alternative literal archive and alternative bodies of evidence. And with these plays, documentary theatre directors contribute to innovative history or her story and female memory in the making. So I'm going to use, as I said, this book, this anthology that contains more than 100 of authentic testimonies, which some of these testimonies have been used in the legal proceedings, but not all of them. So they have been collected, as Lina said, from various sources. Some of them, as I said, were more official, but many of them were not that official. We're not just relying on legal processes and resources. So in this analysis of these three particular plays based on this book, in my research I draw on documentary and media sources as well as interviews with the theatre directors. And the play examined were created and released as by women theatre directors who use performance as a strategy for resistance, for a particular form of justice and for truth-seeking. So these plays have brought to the public, to stage testimonies given by women across or from former Yugoslavia who experience war and violence. And they are unique, as I said, but they are also universally relevant because many of these stories that you can read in this book, you can read, similar stories from women in other parts of the world who experience war and violence. So drawing on documentary theatre as a potential to constitute symbolic reparations for victims of an armed conflict is a relatively, I would say, new work in the field of transitional justice. So with this paper, with this analysis, I try to map the potential of arts and theatre to restore testimony in order to achieve a particular form of reparation for women. And I think that these projects are still largely under-theorized, under-researched, while they present certainly an important tool that can be used and looked more upon in transitional justice field, which also have, and I'm going to talk at the end of the presentation about some of the challenges and limitations of using the documentary theatre. So this is all from the performance crossing the line. So I just want to say a few words about the Balkans and about transitional justice in general in the Balkans. So over the last 2 decades, so the war ended in 1995 with the signing of peace Dayton Accords. And over the past 2 decades, the Balkans has received, I think, quite a lot of attention in terms of, and has been focused for transitional justice processes as a result of the gross human rights violations that happened during the war from 1992 to 1995. And the concept of transitional justice, as you know, refers to how societies deal with the past and how they may come to terms with a history of oppression, violence, and dictatorship. So also the transitional justice field is relatively, I think I can still say that, relatively young field or young discipline still, and while initially it just focused exclusively on judicial proceedings, it has progressed now, expanded in terms of inquiry to encompass all forms of restorative justice as well. So at the beginning we just looked at judicial proceeding in retributive justice, in courts and trials. The field was primarily occupied by legal scholars and by lawyers, but over the last 10-15 years all other disciplines and academics from other disciplines have engaged within this particular discipline. So it's a really interdisciplinary field that is a field of activity and inquiry of how societies address legacies of past. So one of the key goals of transitional justice is to contribute to rebuilding a society based on the rule of law and respect for human rights, and to building sustainable peace. So there is now a general consensus among scholars of transitional justice that although judicial proceedings and accountability for the past crimes or past human rights violations are really necessary, they are not enough. So they're certainly not enough to bring sustainable peace, democracy, and reconciliation. So in many ways, as Marta Mino argues, trials also are not ideal, and the law has very limited capacity to capture and reflect on particular women's experiences and incorporate them, as I said before, fully into the legal form. So law in large part excludes everyday experiences of those, particularly women and other marginalized groups who live in affected or conflicted societies. So the necessity to document and memorialize crimes against humanity in other forums than trials thus became paramount and of really enormous importance. So acting upon this urge to turn to new languages and forms to address issues that stayed unaddressed by legal systems, artists in the Balkans embarked on creative and innovative theatre projects, as they did in other parts of the world, of course, and in other work I looked at Juečkani, Grupo Cultural Juečkani from Peru, and other theatre plays, performances, etc., that emerge after the conflict in order to provide some sort of acknowledgement and justice for survivors. So that same happened in the Balkans with some theatres, and we are talking mainly, of course, about the grassroots theatres here, not about mainstream theatres. So some of the artists and theatres and journalists and photographers, they embarked in these creative and innovative projects. So similar to other countries in transition in the Balkans too, the theatre and art serve as a major contribution to repoliticization of society that is still recovering from a mass violence. And I would say it's still recovering after 20 plus years. We, and I say we because I have these two hats. I still consider myself, I am from the Balkans. So the Balkans and Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia still didn't come to terms with its past. And I think it's very important to stress this because the Balkans as a region has received so much attention and so much of international intervention, and there has been so much money invested in the Balkans in transitional justice and reconciliation, but 20 years plus the results are pretty appalling. It's pretty bad economic, social, political situation, and I'm happy to talk more about it after I finish this talk if you're interested. What's going on now? But many of these initiatives have been primarily supporting retributive justice. That means criminal prosecution, and we had or still have ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and there is a lot of domestic investigations and prosecutions happening in domestic courts in Bosnia, still ongoing. So there are probably around 10,000 people under investigation suspected for war crimes currently at this moment walking in Bosnia waiting to be prosecuted. So this is what we are talking about 20 years plus, how far or not far we came with some of the transitional justice, despite that we had lots of international attention that some countries didn't have. So I think that's very important to bear in mind. So as I just mentioned, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Serbia and Kosovo, apart from retributive justice, so focus on criminal trials, no formal also state-led justice mechanisms operate, really. So in such circumstances where there is an absence of viable national justice mechanisms, much of this creative energy for transition actually comes from below. That means from victims, from survivors, from community and from civil society organizations. So one of these mechanisms and tools is feminist documentary theater, that is communicative act that strives to bring forward, as I said, women's experiences of war and violence. So such theaters, I think, have the potential to break the silence, to break denial, which is still very much present also in the context of the Balkans about what had happened in the war. We have a lot of multiplied truths, contested truth. There is no mutual agreement of the causes and consequences of the war. There's a lot of silence about what has happened in the war. So with these theater plays, they have the potential to break these narratives of denial or the silences, and in that way, as I said, serve as a form of public acknowledgement and recognition of the crimes that happen. So this is really the main aim, to raise this public awareness, to say this is what happened to us, or this is what happened to women, this is what happened to people, to common people, to people who live among us during the war. And this acknowledgement, as we know from literature, is very important to victims. Such acknowledgement carries, or as expressed by Haldeman, an idea of different kind of justice. So this is a different kind of justice that is less vindicative and state-centered, and is more caring. It's more responsive to human suffering. So reparations in general are also different kind of justice that seeks to recognize and address the wrongdoings and harm suffered by victims of human rights abuses. So according to Pablo de Griffith and Ruth Rubio Marin, reparations should be identified as a potentially crucial tool for the affirmation of women's agency in political and social transformation within post-conflict and post-authoritarian states. So this, when I talk about reparations, we talk about or think about material reparations, which are purely financially compensations for the harm suffered. And then we, on another hand, talk about symbolic reparations that do not involve any sort of monetary transfer or transfer of property, but can be diverse, such as memorials, such as public apologies, or educational projects, or theater plays, street performances, and so on. So it is a very diverse plethora of what we actually consider under symbolic reparation. But despite this distinction between material and symbolic reparation, Margaret Urban Walker, she argues that all reparations have, at the end, a symbolic, that is expressive and communicative function. So regardless whether they are monetary or symbolic, all reparations are basically seen by victims as communicative gestures which produce real effects of moral, social, psychological, and political kinds. So for many victims of political violence, what's common for many victims of political violence, it is that this denial of their victim status and the social and political silence about their victimization is the most difficult to bear. So, Lina Vušković, as I said, one of the editors of the book Women's Side of the Stories, affirms that many women in the former Yugoslavia have kept silent because there has been nobody willing to hear their stories, or because it was too painful for them to speak, or because they were afraid to speak out. they were afraid of the consequences of speaking, because why would women or any victim speak out if they don't have a safe environment in which they will speak out, if they don't get something in return for speaking out? We've seen many women who spoke out about their experiences of, for example, sexual violence. After they would speak up, they would be stigmatized and ostracized, their husbands would divorce them and so on. So speaking up is an important act, but we always have to think why we would encourage somebody or victims to speak up, what they will get in return if they speak up. If there are no really mechanisms to support their stories in speaking up, then perhaps maybe it's better that they don't speak up publicly about their experience. So led by this idea of different kind of justice, it is possible to do different kind of justice, innovative and groundbreaking wave of theater now creatively reworks testimonies from women that have been, as I said, for a long time ignored or neglected or marginalized by popular mainstream media in these courses. Also in the Balkans, which is one of the main crimes, as you're probably aware, in the Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it may seem a bit strange to talk about silence in the Balkans and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as I said, because it has received so much attention. And probably one of the crimes it has received a lot of attention was mass rape of women. And a lot of women came out to give their testimonies and tell their stories, and thanks to them we have groundbreaking decisions in terms of law, and sexual violence as crimes against humanity has been finally recognized. That's thanks to women who spoke up about their experiences in the Balkans war. But also these women's stories and women's testimonies of violence have been, if not silenced, as I said, they have been also misused by the governments for achieving all sorts of political gains, and often for no other reason than advancing of one ethnic group of women over others. So it was really used or misused for various purposes, not the purposes that it should be used, but as I said, for advancing particular political gains by the governments. And women victims, not just in the Balkans war, but in any war, are usually presented by numbers and statistics. So when we talk about women victims of rape in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we talk about between 20,000 and 50,000 women. We talk about Peru, 75 women or 80% of women, Quechua-speaking women were raped in Peru and so on. So we usually just present these women in very abstract way, without their names, without their stories, we don't know, without their faces. So they're lost, their stories and their particular experiences are lost in the numbers and in statistics. So they stay faceless, they stay nameless, and only occasionally, as I said, they are remembered by politicians when they wish to emphasize the crimes that was or has been done by the other side, not by their own side, but it was always somebody else who did this crime to their own women. So in this environment, local women's organizations have played really a vital role in preserving women's stories by writing them down and publishing them through various self-publishing outlets. So you have the testimonies of women who survived violence in former Yugoslavia. They are scattered in different publications, but many of these are self-publishing outlets. So due to difficult circumstances in which local women's organizations had to also work during the war, these organizations employed an ad hoc rather than a systematic approach to creating a substantial literal archive of injustices that women survived. So as a result, as I said, such stories are or have been scattered among various magazines, journals and documents read by members of various local organizations, picked up by occasionally researchers and feminist scholars local and international media outlets, and more recently also by theater directors. So documentary theater takes these women's experiences, women's stories seriously, and has the capacity or capability to do so in as an innovative medium that can fully capture an individual woman's journey in dealing with the past and harm she experienced. So they acknowledge and act upon the need to reconceptualize transitional justice from the point of view of women's lived experiences. So that becomes a starting point and an end point, listening to what have women have to say about their experiences. So this is how Dijana Milošević, which is a DACH theater director, explained what was her motivation to start thinking about theater play once she read the book, why she felt that it's maybe important to do something more with these stories. So this collection of the stories reflected a concerted effort to publicize the women's stories for both local and international organizations and audiences. And the book was published in Serbian language, in local language, but it was also published in English. And most of the plays that DACH Theater from Belgrade does they're bilingual, so they do travel with their plays around the world. So they're pretty well established theater in Serbia and in former Yugoslavia. And they performed and toured internationally with their performances, and they do their performances in both of these languages. So
also in Croatian or Albanian?
Not in Albanian, but in Croatia, I mean, we have Croatian, Serbian, and Bosnian, which are, as you probably know, I can't say, it's not politically correct to say it's the same language, but it is more or less.
I understand.
Yeah, it's more or less the same language. It's just, I guess, we're trying to reinvent some of the languages, so we are more different from each other, but we absolutely understand each other, and I can say it's the same. So they do travel with this performance. They traveled in Yugoslavia, but I don't think they don't speak Albanian, but Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian, and as I said, in English. So what they're also trying to, it's very important for them to, as I said, to bring these stories, live experiences on the stage, and to help women to see their lives politically by raising awareness of their oppression and challenging dominant views, and at the same time encouraging women's creativity. So it gives voice to women's repressed, ignored, and untold experiences, and explores feelings while creating a common language of survivors in which they can see each other represented. So this process of collecting these stories in the book, The Women's Side of the War, was a deliberate and collective effort to give victims or survivors a voice, to break, as I said, the silence surrounding the crimes committed against them, and to transform these private abuses that were experienced individually and that were pretty hidden away from the public into collective empathy and acknowledgements of crimes committed. So the collecting, archiving, and publishing of survivor testimonies has become the key ritual. And as you know, this is not just in the Balkans, but in many post-conflict societies, as a tool to deal with the violent past. So it became very important to collect the stories and to give them some meaning and to publish them and in that way give public acknowledgement to survivors. So it was, as I said, concerted effort to preserve and archive testimonies that feminist activists and practitioners, too busy with their work on the ground and direct assistance to survivors, had not, always struggled with the time how to collect these stories and archive themselves. So, but they thought that it was very important to bring them together, and in a hope that by bringing these stories together it will help to prevent the stories from being forgotten or lost, and would stave off a collective amnesia about what happened in the war. So it was also very established in the literature that the telling a story of trauma becomes a testimony, and in the hearing the listener engages in an act of remembering forward that obliges to receive rather than repress in human events. So how valuable and significant these stories are is indicated by how quickly, following the book being published, Dijana Milošević, who is the director of the Theater and activist from Belgrade, she decided very quickly to make a play based on these stories. And soon after, the other two theater directors from Serbia and from Kosovo and from Bosnia also embarked on similar projects. So the 3 plays have been produced on the basis of the book, and they all share, I guess, 2 main aims. First, to bring women's voices into the public realm and make these women's experiences real, and second, to confront the audience with what has been done in their name by their governments, right? So all 3 plays capture the suffering of women, as I said, across ethnic lines and divisions, to show that pain and suffering do not have particular class, particular ethnicity, or particular religion. So while the theater possesses the power to build a bridge between people and confront them with issues often left unspoken, unlike the judicial system, it does not really seek any resolution or does not declare a verdict. There is no judgment. So theatrical forums may raise questions by presenting facts as well as different views and complexities that are inherent in a particular situations, but they always leave the audience to reflect and reconsider their views and positions. So this is what one of the women who was in the audience said after listening to these stories. Another important thing with the theater that I'm talking about in these theater performances, and for Theater, after the performance they would open, and this performance is probably around 45 minutes, and after that performance they open facilitated discussion with an audience. So in this facilitated discussion they hear new stories. Sometimes women for the first time tell what happened to them in the war, and sometimes would, of course, males from the audience also say that they didn't know about this. This is the first time they hear that women survived this, and so on. So it's organized in a way that audience can express also their feelings and their thinking about the performance, and share that with the director of the theater and with actresses. And this is what one of the women, of course, you know, these theatrical plays trigger a lot of trauma and memories, but they also invite some of the women and other victims to tell their stories for the very first time. So the play made by the Theater in Belgrade is called Crossing the Line. And the performance, I should also say that it's really interesting, the performance was actually made, the first performance was played as a part of promotion of the book. So once the book, this book has been published, the editors of the book were thinking how to promote this book in Serbia. And because Theater is working on social justice issues and is very well known for doing, bringing the stories of the marginalized people to the stage, they invited the Theater to make a play which was originally just 10-15 minutes that would accompany the launching of the book. So the first play that they've done was just lasted for 15 minutes, and they traveled with editors to promote this book, and that's how they've done promotion of the book, by using the theater, by inviting them to do the play that would make the promotion of the book original and innovative and very different, right? In a more lively way, by engaging the audience through visual, not only verbal senses. So the editors invited Dach to make a play based on the collection. And this is when Dijana Milošević, who is the director of the Dach Theatre, immediately decided to do so. So the idea also of this book was to serve as an incentive, as an encouragement for other women to open up, to tell their stories, and through confession of their own suffering, recognize the suffering of others. That was very important. So there is no doubt that some of the women wartime experiences which were retold on the stage prompted, as I said, the other women in the audience to open up about their own archives of pain and share them. If not in front of the audience, what would happen, they would share them privately with the troop members. So once that facilitated discussion is over, they would have usually drinks, and in these private forums the women would come to them and tell their stories. And I asked troop members if they recorded these stories. They didn't, but they listened to these stories. These are professional actresses, and but they have heard a lot of these stories in public forums and in private stories. So the more stories have emerged and been triggered by this play. So this is what one of the women said in Bosnia after the play, during, as I said, these informal gatherings with audiences, when women would come to the troop members and tell about their own ordeals of either wartime rape or other experiences of war, and how important these ones are for them. And again, we know that empirical studies reveal that survivors, they want to share their stories and learn also from others what happened to them during the violence. So through mirroring stories of unseen women previously untold and unheard and now given and received, the theatres really open up a complex and difficult conversation that community needs to face. So this is again what Dijana has to say, that by playing this performance we give acknowledgement to what happened to women, and we think it's important to talk about it. So these are the first steps in reconciliation process, to talk about what happened, who did what, who is accountable, to show women that they are not alone. So this play is a form of symbolic reparation for the harm they suffered. And Dach Theatre, as I said, toured or performed this particular play internationally, and what Dijana Milošević had to say, that she said that, and I quote, she was really struck how our local story, which is rooted really in our region, our politics and history, has become universal by using the language of the theatre and art, and has crossed these intercontinental borders and became a unique story in that sense, because they, by traveling internationally and talking to other audiences, they could see that, you know, these stories, of course, while rooted in a local, in particular politics, they are, as I said, also universal, and that the other women who experienced had very similar experiences from the war. So this is all from their play. Please feel free to interrupt me and just ask me any questions if you have. This is again just one of the testimonies. So this is interesting. As you know, what happened in times of war and desperate times, that you also have this particular situations where you develop friendships and relationships, and people come to help each other. They destroy each other on one hand, but there is also this necessity to come together to support each other.
Where is Novi Sad?
It's in Vojvodina, Serbia. Okay, so I just will now talk about this. So this is a second performance that I will talk briefly about. That's again on the same book based, and it's done in Kosovo. So Zana Krasnici, who directed the play, and the play is called in Kosovo In the Valley of Her Sufferings. To director of Art Polis Kosovo and Zana Krasnici, the theatre director, she said it's important to present stories that are true and tell about war crimes, people who were lost love and friendship in wartime. And she said the stories are part of our shared history in the Balkans. So listening to these women's experiences give us an opportunity to talk about and deal with what happened during the wars, to face the past. It also allows us to transform us today and hope that we in the future can forgive each other for what had happened. So I want the audience to feel and recognize women's experiences of war. I wish that women's opposition to war and fight for peace will be recognized. So in this play is, of course, differently done. It's using the same, as I said, not necessarily the same stories, but it's based on the same book of testimonies. And in this play, all female actresses are dressed in long black dresses, and the color of black is traditionally symbol of grief and mourning. So each actress retell the testimony of one woman, and in one of the scenes, for example, a young actress with the long dark hair is sitting on a stool with an open notebook in her left hand and pencil in her right hand. She gazes over an audience and speaks in a low-pitched voice. And she's telling the story. It was the morning of 28 March 1998, the first day of Eid. After less than an hour, in our backyard came a lot of scorpions. These are a paramilitary Serbian group. The actress then started to pace the stage frantically while sobbing, grasping for breath and pulling the tips of her long hair. And she said, I saw Arberi, he was blind. I saw my grandmother. She then stops to look at the audience and says, I had 2 bullets in my leg, 1 in my back and 13 on my left arm. I fainted. So such symbolic representations of what had happened can help concretize a traumatic event, and can be also physical and visual representations of what was lost. So these representations can also aid recovery and help an individual to come to terms with the event they grieve upon, while materializing society's willingness to do things differently. Also, what's important to Zana Krasnici, who is the theatre director of this particular play, but also for other theatre directors that I'm talking about, is important that to acknowledge that women are victims, but not only victims, that they're also agents and survivors, and to show the strength that they have to fight for their own and for their family and other survival. So it's very important for them to represent women not only in the role of the victim. So this is from the Kosovo theatre play. So what Dijana Milošević said, that after watching Crossing the Line, that she thinks that people leave the theatre with the feeling of terrible tragedy that happened to the women, but also she wants audiences to feel that women have this incredible strength to continue life. When tragedies happen in families, often men are totally devastated, that's what Dijana says, while women are rebuilding houses, trying to take care of family members they became active, they become activists and fight for and with other women. Women have dignity and pride. It will always stay with me that in Sarajevo during the siege, women wore makeup and try to look nice when they go out on the streets. So it's very important to keep up this pride and dignity despite, suffering and going through enormous pain. So this is still from Crossing the Line. And the last one I want to talk about is from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I talk about Dark Theatre from Serbia, I talked about Art Polis from Kosovo, and this one is again based on the same book made by Tanja Miletić-Oručević, who is the director of the play Seven Breaths, and comes from Mostar, from Bosnia and Herzegovina. For her, it's very important what the performances can have educational or be used as educational tool as well. She said that the scant information is available to young people, and that most young people know very little about war. This may come as a surprising again for Bosnia and Herzegovina, but all research shows that young people are either not interested, and we are talking about this, the war happened, as you know, 20 years, how it was over, but the young generation is either not interested in the war or has totally distorted picture about the war and full of national pride and resentment towards the other ethnic groups. And they know really in general very little about the war because, and that's another topic, they don't really study in the history textbooks in their schools about the war. So they know very, very little. And sometimes if you, after the watching of particular movies or documentaries after the war or listening to these performances, they would say that they had no idea that this happened in their country. So I'm talking about the generation which was born during the war, 1992, or just first generation after the war, which have very little awareness of what had happened. So, what Tanja Miletić-Oručević, the director of the play Seven Breaths, said that they, young people have very little information, and this information comes from what they hear from their families, and is usually this content of the story that they hear from their families is very politicized. It's one ideological content in order to sustain national myths, right? Which is pretty empty and lacks any human story and content. And this is why it is important for us, she said, to play this importance. So she said that she heard many times from young people after watching this performance that they didn't know anything about what had happened. So in this sense, the play has an educational function too. So, as I said, the audience in the theatre bears also witness to a testimony that otherwise may not be heard, and their presence indicates this public acknowledgement of crimes that were committed towards women. So in that sense, the audience really actively engaged in an act of moral, symbolic reparation by participating in shared understanding, which has the capacity, again, to produce empathy, solidarity, and space for insight and for public discussion forum. Actress and director of the theatre play is there to talk about. So it's a really different kind of forum they create. They basically, by bringing these women's stories to the public, documentary plays have improvised, in some ways, truth and reconciliation commission, right, on stage, and invite audiences to bear witness to women's stories, but also to body language, to glances and to gestures that are created by actors. and exists outside of the archive. So it's not just about verbal testimony, but it's about using the bodily language and expressions to add to that particular verbal narrative. So in this particular play you have only one actress Mirela Miljačank-Kordić, who really brings the powerful verbal and bodily expression to the stage. So in each story she transforms into 7 different women whose stories were pushed basically under the carpet and who were never encouraged to talk about their experiences. So she brings on the stage the constructed images of the women whose testimonies she retells, so the spectator do not need to imagine women from the archive, that women are in full bodily presence before them. So in this play, Mirela, she wears for each story different costumes when telling each woman's story, but her also whole body language and voice transforms too, so that she at one point becomes a woman journalist from Vukovar, then she becomes a young woman, then she becomes a rape victim, then she becomes a mother who lost a husband and 2 sons, then she becomes a girl child who spent her childhood under the siege in Sarajevo, or a mother who lost her daughter and who is desperate to save dead body from being left in the middle of the road despite being wounded herself. So through her performance, Mirela's body's language is added to the archive and infuses the documentary theatre, making the archive repertory. So these physical visualizations provides significant addition to the archive by bringing something that literally the archives lack, and which obviously theatre has a capacity to powerfully do so and express very powerfully. So in documentary theatre that I'm talking about today, documents from the archives, testimonies scattered, buried in different places, are presented through different media to the audience, allowing audience to react to a presentation that is fully expressed before their eyes and ears. What also was important for, I think, for these plays, that they, of course, audience is not just, although these plays are based on the women testimonies, but in audience you have, of course, males and men who come to watch this performance. And it's believed that by men too can develop better understanding of women's particular experiences with the war and violence. So when I was, in 2012, I was watching the Crossing the Line, this performance made by the Dpto in Belgrade. And after the theatre play, there were several war veterans from Serbia watching the same performance with me. And after the theatre play, we had these informal discussions, we had drinks, and I found myself standing next to a war veteran from Serbia who spent 4 years fighting in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in between, drinking our glasses of wine, the war veteran, he turned towards me and he whispered, he said, "It was so difficult for me to watch this performance." And he said, "I feel terrible that some of my comrades may have committed those crimes towards women." He said, "How can anyone do this? I have a wife and daughter too." So he was saying to me that he was not aware to the extent of what has been done to women, and what's of course not uncommon that males and war veterans who participated in the war and even perpetrators, they will never admit that they themselves committed crimes against women, but they would say that somebody else has done that. So he just expressed his surprise by what he had to hear. So I think it's really very important, and I write elsewhere why I think these performances are important, because they can bring some of these testimonies to, by playing these performances in remote, in distant areas of the countries, in communities which are not necessarily literate, who don't speak English to follow what's happening before International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, who don't necessarily read the press or books. They bring these stories because they travel and they play in these remote areas, and they raise awareness about some of these stories that, many of the people, after listening to these stories, they would say that they absolutely have not been aware of. And we are talking about 15 plus or 20 plus years after the war, and talking in particular about the audience in Serbia, and because of course audience in Bosnia has directly experienced the war, so some of them would be more familiar, but not younger generation. So younger generation is something else that's, as I said, needs to be more aware of some of the issues, and this is one of the ways that you can engage them. So if you tell them, here is the book, go and read this book about women's testimonies, they won't do that. They won't read any of our books. But if you do something in 40 minutes with a performance such as this, that would have much bigger impact on them. And sometimes also survivors, women survivors, were part of the audience too. So not just telling their stories, but they would come to this place to basically watch their experiences or testimonies relived on the stage. So I'm just going to talk quickly about some of the challenges and limitations of the document theatre. So in the process, this process of making documented theatre is not without its challenges and its limitations. So the editor, as the editor of the book, Women's Side of the Story, said she put forward the condition to everyone who wants to use this book publicly not to change the word from authentic testimony. So if you want to use this book, or if you want to use the testimonies for the performance, that was their condition. You can use, it's free to be used, but you can't change anything, or you can't change original testimony of the women. However, the testimonies have to be shortened, but the authenticity of the particular experience cannot be compromised. So there is no manipulation and interpretation of the text. Because these stories collected in the book are considered public testimonies, because every word spoken is a testimony, according to Women in Black. So the essence is in preserving and archiving authentic women's history, which has been underrated and muted for a long time. So the theatre directors and Women in Black precondition posed an normative creative challenge to turn documentary material, which did not necessarily meet the criteria of a compelling dramatic text, into living, breathing theatrical material. However, this request and condition to keep the authentic story was important, of course, in order to preserve women's authentic words. So bringing, as you can imagine, some of these stories are very short, some of them are long, and bringing whole story to the theatrical stage is not possible, of course, during the timing and durational constraints, or due to content of the story, which may not be coherent or appealing to the audience. So it has become expected that women's testimonies will in some way be cut and be shortened to fit within particular structure of the play. So this decision-making process in terms of which part of the testimonies will be heard and preserved and will become the alternative literary archive is governed basically by the playwright and by the director. So, so they tried to, in minimal, as much as possible, to just cut what is necessary and show what is or can fit within the time constraints. So, as I said, some of this work is particularly challenging in terms of preserving. How do you preserve authentic testimonies on one hand, and on the other hand, how do you make a decision which particular parts of the stories you are going to tell? So during these creative processes of maybe cutting and these movements in between, what's going to be preserved, which stories are going to be told, maybe something is lost because the woman's, again, full story cannot be honored from the beginning to an end. As I said at the beginning, that's what we see often see in the courtrooms and in the trials. It's not possible for women to tell their own stories, but also within the theater, it's not always possible to let the full story to be told. So some of these things have to be compromised, but theater directors said they've done the best they can to, of course, preserve authentic the story. One of the limitations of documentary theater is that on its own it cannot, this type of theater cannot trigger significant, of course, change in society. So there is no illusion that this can bring enormous change. It can serve, as I said, symbolic recognition of a victim's harms, but it needs to be accompanied by other initiatives. So as Diana Milošević, the director of Dpto Theater, said, like, documentary theater can, of course, open the space for discussion of certain topics, but it would be naive to believe that it can make sort of transformative changes. It can change individual lives of victims and survivors who tell their story, perhaps, by providing this symbolic reparation. It can also change and trigger something in individual lives of spectators, audience, to empower them, to make them more, perhaps, proactive to do something. And in that sense, it can have wider effects, but without other social mechanisms such as law, courts, human rights, economy, it can not resolve structural problems, right? So it can influence, it can contribute towards social transformation, but this potential for change, and this even small potential for change, should be embraced and further utilized. So, just to finish off, so these three theater plays that I talked about, they use the tool of the documentary and the function of the archives as procedures for inducing new flows and transaction between images, narratives, texts, statements, events, audiences. So they review and they recontextualize written accounts of human rights violations as women's forgotten stories, and bring those experiences and feelings of stage. So by bringing raw, authentic victims or women's testimonies, the plays seek to disturb the dominant system of representation that usually refuse women the possibility of representing themselves, and thereby denying in that way their agency and their subjectivity and individuality. So theater directors have all, I guess, also identified the limited role of the law to fully capture, as the scholars have recognized, as I mentioned at the beginning, the very limited capacity of the law to capture the experiences of women, and have intervened into this by inserting women's voices into recovery and transitional justice processes. So they made intentionally their presence visible and their testimony relevant and acknowledged by using evidence which is often beyond the reach of public consumption in a creative and constructive way. So while theater, as I said, has this capacity to explore legacies of conflict and to establish space for discussion, social this action needs to be supported from outside also the theater of the theater context. The documentary play that they do is not, I think, only a human gesture and the gesture of solidarity and empathy, but it's also political action against impunity and against collective amnesia. So it's action which resists denial, which resists minimizing or ignoring the harms that have been experienced by women by providing public space for acknowledging the particular harms and injustices. So it's a very important tool for of symbolic justice that I think needs to be cherished and needs to be accounted for as a very creative innovation to respond to past atrocity. Thank you. Gracias.
For this very interesting presentation. Now we start with questions. Where do we start? I have different questions. For example, these three theater companies from Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo work together or work independently?
So it's all independently. You just decided on their own to pick up the book once it was published, which is positive. And then, they worked completely separate, independently. And the theater plays, the theater directors have chosen the different testimonies to tell, and it's a different choreography and everything else. So yes.
And the book, for example, the stories from the books came from
all over former Yugoslavia.
From
yes, from ex-Yugoslavia, from the war experiences of women across former Yugoslavia. So they were just compiled, all these testimonies, but they come from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. And I think that's, as I said, very important because we still have quite a big ethnic and religious division in Yugoslavia. So they really are trying to bring these experiences at universal level, regardless of ethnicity of women. They all suffer the same crimes, just by different men. Basically, the crimes were more or less the same.
But these were also actually only published in 2008, or 2007 the first time.
The first time, yes.
So that means 22 years after the end of the war.
Yes, yes. So as I said, many of these stories have been published in self-publishing materials by small NGOs, by women NGOs. They were scattered in different articles and journals, but they were not brought into one edition. So what they've done is that, so that's why it's pretty special by bringing them into one collective text.
I mean, to which degree does this actually connect with, I mean, we have at least 100 years of political theater in Western Europe. I mean, the tradition in leftist circles, progressive circles from the early 20th century onwards to use very consciously theater as a way of reaching audiences that can't be reached otherwise. And so the whole idea of basically doing something that may be called agit pop, or also then in socialist Europe after 1945, and somebody like Brecht goes into Eastern Germany and very consciously draws on theatrical traditions in terms of reaching audiences, which at the same time goes back to Aristotle. I mean, what you described in terms of the whole idea of the audience engaging with the performers, and the whole idea of catharsis, the idea that the audience is learning. I mean, this is to some degree straight out of Aristotle. I mean, there is not, we are having something like 2,000 plus years of history of, drama and stage play, that then at a certain point very consciously gets picked up in socialist Eastern Europe. And the question would come to my mind is to which degree do we have leftovers of socialist training then basically blossoming into something like these theater movements in, post-Yugoslavia, whatever, Eastern European societies.
And you're absolutely right. So this is not a new idea to pick up the stories and bring them on the stage. And that has been, as Irante pointed out, like we have a long history of this. I think what I was interested to bring these stories within the transitional justice particular framework and think about how this works with the symbolic reparations. I think that's the angle that I take. Yes, yeah. And it's very difficult to evaluate what does this mean for audience, but I am interested, and I think I'm interested in particular in women's experiences of the war and the methodology they use, and I was interested to listen to what audience have to say about this and how they, so just using different methods to bring to transitional justice processes, but this is not, as you rightly say, this is not new technique. It's just something to bring into discussion what's currently happening in some of these societies. Because, as I said at the beginning, these grassroots and alternative innovative justice responses are not picked up necessarily by the literature, and discussed in a way that I and others are trying to discuss, talking about what sort of the role have arts in general has to do in transitional justice. That's something in this field pretty new, how that can contribute to the particular processes of reconciliation, of crossing the ethnic bridges and so on. So thinking through this prism and working empirical research, I guess, being and listening to, talking to theatre directors and talking to the audience and just trying to think what does that mean for victims or survivors of violence, and in particular for women. And I think it's interesting because, and again, I think it's very important to stress that I think that the Balkans is the area in which we've seen, as I said, so much intervention, and there is a still need to do more. So to say this is not enough. So you have the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, you have domestic persecutions, lots of things, billions of dollars invested there, and 25 years plus, where are we? We're still so we need to do more. So why with all these interventions there still needs to be more done? And because International Criminal Tribunal, which spent more than $1 billion, prosecuted 160 people, and as I said, you have 10,000 more still walking around the country, and you still have many people and young generations who are not aware of what had happened. They just don't know what had happened, because history doesn't teach them really that in schools. That's an interesting separate story. But I think that the work that they've done in raising awareness and keeping the memory alive, as you would know from this pain, is very important. Just constantly serving as a constant reminder that this has happened, that these people cannot be, forgotten, and these women live amongst us. It's just trying to create solidarity and empathy and return something to the victims. As I think that. Yeah, maybe just leave it there. We can come back.
Yeah. How about the men? Them, do we have plays written by them, movies written?
There is a play, not much, that hasn't been really popular, but there is one play that uses stories of war veterans, where war veterans who were in war in Bosnia and Serbia, they come on the stage and they don't tell necessarily their own stories, they say fragments of their stories, but they talk about war, so whole performance is about war. So, and it's interesting, and because as you can, it is a bit controversial, right? Because people do tend to look like they struggle to see war veterans. They are either heroes or they are perpetrators, right? So some people in the audience see them as the perpetrators, and they don't want to see them as, they want them to be dehumanized. So they don't want to hear from them that they also suffered something. They said, you are the guilty because you went in war and you deserve what happened to you. Don't tell me that you were a victim of something too. So it was pretty controversial, and that particular play didn't receive any really particular attention. But there has been some collection of males victims of torture and war veterans collected, again in self-publishing in local languages only by victims associations. But males, as you know, have really difficulties to come to the forum and tell their stories as the victims. There has been research, very little research about their experiences of torture, and their particular experiences of sexual crimes during the war. So we all know about mass sexual violence in the war against the women, but males have also been victims of sexual abuse and torture during the war. And because there is a much more stigma about this issue, males won't come out to tell their stories. So that's another, you have lots of stigma with women telling their stories of a particular sexual abuse, but then how will men come out to tell their stories? And the other thing is that you don't have as many, or you don't have actually males non-governmental organizations. There are women's non-governmental organizations, hundreds of them in former Yugoslavia, who work with women victims. But there are just like few who call themselves associations of war veterans and who gathers the male mainly, but they are not anywhere in the public.
But they're veterans organizations.
They are.
No, I mean, one of the possible
Yes.
consequences would be to say we don't have veterans organizations because we don't really want to deal with this. I mean, West Germany after 1945 didn't have veterans organizations.
Mm-hmm.
It was a non-extant group.
Mm-hmm.
So the way male experience of World War II was completely different channel because
Mm-hmm.
there was no positive way of identifying anyhow with World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So that had to find completely different. And in the late 70s, there was a scholar in Germanic studies who wrote a habilitation on how certain types of popular trashy literature used the prism of World War I and World War I experience of discussing indirectly World War II experiences. That habilitation caused an academic outcry because for political reasons people didn't know what to do with it. The book was later published, but the guy never had an established normal academic career. So from that perspective, the fact that you have veterans organizations suggests an interesting way of actually phrasing it, because the other thing will, of course, be to which degree the Serbian War or the breakup of Yugoslavia refers back to narratives of Yugoslavian history and its emergence out of World War II, and then the emergence of whatever lies before, out of Ottoman Empire and Habsburg Empire. So you have layers of layers of layers where to some degree you have so many skeletons and closets.
Yeah, I know. It's complex history, as you said, but I think, and thanks for sharing the example from Germany. You're right, there are few, I should say there are very few veterans organizations in Bosnia. War veterans in Serbia are not recognized because Serbia, it was not officially in the war. So there are, according to some, estimations around, between 300,000 to 500,000 war veterans in Serbia, but they enjoy no legal status, they were not recognized. But in Bosnia there are few of them, and they don't receive any attention. They are very marginalized, really, and downplayed, and these stories have not been of interest to researchers so far. And I think another thing is because of this controversial status, whether they are victims of the perpetrators and they were directly involved in the fighting, they have been looked upon pretty negatively, I should say, whether that's with reason or not, but they don't enjoy really any study. You can't compare women NGO scene with a male NGO scene in that sense. I mean, all international donors and foreigners gave to women victims because they were seen as an innocent victim. Now we come to hierarchy of victims. Males are not seen really as a authentic victim or ideal victim. They are, seen more as a perpetrator, or they are, somewhere at the bottom of this hierarchy. Although they are, of course, used by political elites, and in Bosnia they were recognized. You have reparation for, they enjoy pensions for veterans. But they are not organized in a way that women are organized, and trying to be organized and bring some of these voices. And of course, women organizations, they don't want to have anything with them because they see them as the ones who, created the pain and suffering on the women. So there hasn't been really much attention. There hasn't been much writing about males as victims. As far as I'm aware, there have been maybe 2, 3 full articles about, and I've written one book chapter on males as victims of sexual violence in war. But that's pretty much it, because of this controversial status they have. Yeah?
Yo voy a hablar en castellano, hablo despacio por si acaso. Quizá en parte de lo que estabais hablando en relación a tiene que ver con cómo la justicia transicional construye a las víctimas, ¿no? O sea, esta idea de víctima que no puede tener ningún tipo de participación, ¿no? O sea, quitarle la carga política, quitarle la carga de agencia que tenemos como personas, ¿no? O sea, en ese sentido, a mí me parecía muy interesante lo que comentabas en torno a cómo en general en todas las obras también se buscaba representar a las mujeres no solo como víctimas, sino como luchadoras, aunque sea después, ¿no? O sea, no quedarse en esa idea. Y me preguntaba, pensando en las obras de teatro como reparación, si no tiene que ver también con ese choque de una justicia transicional desde arriba y lo que necesita la sociedad desde abajo, pensando en la Corte Penal Internacional y en el tema de los juicios y la atención que ha tenido esa zona, y aún así se siguen necesitando luchas contra la impunidad a nivel civil, ¿no? Entre las personas, no de arriba abajo, sino entre las personas. Y no sé si conoces, como hablabas al principio de un estudio comparativo, en Argentina durante mucho tiempo, bueno, sigue estando a día de hoy, pero a partir de, yo creo que es del 98, empieza a funcionar Teatro por la Identidad. No tiene una perspectiva de género, nace desde las abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, para que la gente se pregunte si puede ser un hijo de desaparecido, y empieza a funcionar en ese momento y ha seguido todos los años trabajando. No sé si lo conocías, que a lo mejor en algún momento te puede servir para...
So what you're saying is that that transitional justice was first focused on the victim, that it is created to focus on the victims, and because victims have been neglected for so many years, so this became focus for transitional justice. The victims are in focus rather than perpetrators. But what's interesting that now more and more we are thinking we need to bring also perpetrators. We can't just talk just only about the victims. We need to bring the perpetrators in the stories as well. But yeah, and then that's what these theatre plays is to engage in the local, which has nothing to do with international. It's a for local audience. It's for local people. It's for trying to build the social relationship and integration, and trying to do something for themselves, not for themselves, for their own people, without necessarily any other influences or regardless of the international justice. Is that right?
Sí.
Yes. I'm not sure. Was a particular question that I didn't pick up, or it was just...
No, era un comentario.
Sí, and yes, of course, Argentina and the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo and the rest of that, as you mentioned. Sorry, what was your name? Dagmar. As Dagmar mentioned, these are this is not something unique in that sense, you know, that they invented something, you know, this has been a history in many other post-conflict places. But what I guess, as I said previously, I think it's so important to look at these grassroots, and in particular in the places, I mean, in Argentina you had a lot of retributive justice as well, but in the places where you don't have criminal prosecutions, you really have to rely on that. And I guess that would be in Spain case. Like if you are missing anything else, I think that becomes so even more, I don't know if I can say, I don't want to make ours even more important in the places that, and there are many places that actually, you know, the cases of the Balkans and Argentina are exceptional, and Peru, that they receive international attention. There has been something going on, truth requisition commissions or criminal prosecutions, but in many other places in the world there is nothing, you know. In Kenya, just processes, not in Kenya, sorry, in Mozambique, for example, there is just amnesty laws and amnesia and nothing else. So people had to invent their own rituals and symbols to help each other, and I think that's very important. And it's very important that we study some of these rituals or how we can use them better as a tool to help people to heal and reintegrate and cross the bridges. You know, we can't just rely on international community to do something. So we all try to invite international community or international organizations to put pressure on the governments, but that just doesn't happen in many places. So sometimes you are just left with these ones, and I think looking by what they can do becomes important, because sometimes they are the only mechanism that you have to rely on the country to, if you want to keep the memory alive and archive the history, really, if you want to preserve some of the stories, that becomes very, very important.
An example, maybe it's interesting because this is art exhibition or arts creation after conflicts. And for example, in Palestine now, in West Bank, it's making this kind of art to express how the violence affects the people, and it's it's not post after conflict, because
it's happening
in the moment. For example, have a festival is in March, I think, if I remember well. It's in the city. It's all a piece of art making for different artists in the city, and you can walk around. It's in Ramallah, and you can walk in the city and watch this kind of, and maybe it's interesting for you to compare with.
So bringing to the public space.
Yeah, and something is art, it's a play, or it's a painting, or it's a performance, or here. Oh, you have any? Okay,
Already
thank
talked too
you.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.